What happens when the oldest objects we have are not silent at all, but speaking in a language we no longer know how to hear? Across deserts, cave walls, burial chambers, and weathered fields, there are artifacts that seem to wait for us with unusual patience. A carved face with eyes too large to forget. A symbol pressed into stone that looks strangely modern. A pattern repeated across continents that should never have shared the same dream. None of these discoveries comes with a final answer. They arrive instead as fragments, carrying the mood of a half-remembered sentence. For generations, history was told as a straight road. We began in darkness, we learned slowly, and step by step, we became who we are. It is a comforting story because it gives the past neat edges. But the earth is rarely neat. It keeps what it wants. It erases context, preserves odd details, and leaves behind objects that do not fit cleanly into the timelines we prefer. Some mysteries are eventually solved by patience, chemistry, and better tools. Others resist us, not because they prove wild theories or overturn everything we know, but because they expose a simpler truth. Human history is larger than our summaries of it, more layered, more fragile, more full of forgotten experiments, vanished meanings, and symbols that once made perfect sense to someone standing under another sky. This is not a story about certainty. It is a journey through unease, wonder, and the quiet dignity of not knowing. We will walk among ancient figurines, impossible carvings, sacred paintings, and stones that seem to map both land and memory. At every step, the question will remain the same. Are we discovering lost answers, or only the true depth of our own ignorance? Maybe the past does not hide from us out of malice. Maybe it simply refuses to be reduced. And maybe that refusal is the beginning of wisdom. What do we do with a face that feels both ancient and strangely unfamiliar? In the dry soil of southern Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered small clay figures from the Ubaid culture, some of the oldest human settlements ever found. At first glance, they seem simple enough. Terracotta bodies, slender limbs, a mother holding a child, a figure standing in quiet authority. But then the eye adjusts, the heads are elongated, the features taper into something almost reptilian. The eyes stretch wide and almond-shaped, as if they belong to a memory that does not fit inside ordinary human form. These figurines are not violent. That may be what makes them so haunting. One appears to nurse an infant with unmistakable tenderness. Another seems posed not as a monster or a warning, but as a person known well enough to be remembered. They do not feel like inventions made for fear. They feel observed, intimate, familiar to the hands that shaped them. Scholars have offered careful explanations. Some suggest they represent ritual beings, symbolic ancestors, or stylized religious figures. Others point to evidence of deliberate cranial modification in ancient communities and wonder whether these objects portray real people, perhaps an elite class whose appearance was altered over time. In that reading, what looks strange to us may once have signaled status, devotion, or identity. And yet the mystery remains larger than any single answer. Similar serpent or reptile-like beings appear across the ancient imagination in stories, carvings, and sacred symbols separated by oceans and centuries. Not proof of one hidden origin, perhaps, but evidence that human beings, again and again, have looked beyond themselves when trying to explain knowledge, order, and power. Maybe that is the deeper meaning of these figures. They remind us that the earliest people were not only surviving, they were imagining. They were asking who shaped them, who guided them, and whether wisdom comes only from within a culture, or sometimes arrives wearing a face we do not recognize. What if the most unsettling discoveries are not the ones buried deepest, but the ones painted openly on stone? High on the walls of ancient caves and sheltered rock faces, human beings left behind images that still seem to breathe. Some are familiar at once: bison in motion, deer mid-stride, hunters with bows, hands pressed in pigment like signatures against time. But then there are other forms, harder to place: tall figures with rounded heads, bodies that appear dressed, masked, or enclosed. Shapes that seem to stand apart from the ordinary life unfolding around them. For more than a century, researchers have debated what such images mean. In some places, they may represent the shamans in ceremonial dress. In others, dancers, spirits, or mythic beings seen in trance and transformed into visual language. The farther back we look, the less likely it becomes that art was only decorative. These walls were not museums. They were thresholds where memory, ritual, fear, and wonder met in flickering firelight. Modern eyes are quick to impose modern categories. We look at an ancient figure and ask whether it resembles a visitor, a machine, a suit, or an impossible technology. That impulse says as much about us as it does about the past. We are a culture trained to compare mystery with invention. Earlier peoples may have understood those same shapes in profoundly different ways. As ancestors, forces of nature, dream presences, or glimpses of another layer of reality that lived alongside the visible world. And still, the images endure because they resist reduction. Their power lies not in proving one idea, but in holding several possibilities at once. They ask us to remember that the first storytellers were not naive. They were observers of weather, animal movement, night skies, birth, death, in altered states of mind. They knew the world was full of things that could be seen and things that could only be felt. Perhaps the real mystery is not whether ancient people witnessed something extraordinary. Perhaps it is that they understood, long before we did, that human experience is always larger than explanation. How can a stone no larger than a hand carry the weight of a civilization's silence? When the Phaistos Disc emerged from the soil of Crete in the early 20th century, it looked almost too deliberate, too modern in its precision. A circle of fired clay, stamped with tiny symbols, arranged in a spiraling path, as if language itself had been asked to walk inward. There were human heads, tools, plants, animals, shields, and abstract marks, each pressed into the surface with careful repetition. It did not resemble a rough draft of writing. It resembled confidence. And that confidence is what unsettles us. We can read Egyptian inscriptions, Mesopotamian tablets, Greek texts, and many fragments of the ancient Mediterranean world. But this object remains stubbornly closed. Because no other text like it has been found, scholars have been left with too little context and too much imagination. Is it a hymn, a prayer, a ritual chant, a record, a game, a calendar? Was it a message meant for many or for a single initiated circle? Its method matters as much as its meaning. The symbols were stamped, not carved one by one, leading some to call it one of the earliest known examples of movable type printing. If that is true, then the disc does more than preserve mystery. It hints at a level of technical creativity that feels unexpectedly advanced, as though an old world briefly discovered a future idea and then let it vanish. Yet the greatest force of the disc lies in its refusal. It survives without translation, surviving not as a statement, but as a boundary. It reminds us that literacy is fragile and that even in cultures we study carefully, whole systems of thought can slip out of reach. A script disappears, a language falls quiet, a people are absorbed or broken by time, and meaning becomes pattern. We often imagine the past is incomplete because it has lost its objects. But sometimes the objects remain, and it is interpretation that fails. In those moments, history becomes less like a library and more like a shoreline, where each wave leaves behind another intact fragment from a world whose voice we can almost, but not quite, hear. What if the map we trust most is the one we have not yet learned to read? Long before satellites stitched the planet into a seamless image, human beings were already trying to grasp the shape of the world. They did it with memory, with stars, with coastlines repeated in story, and with lines scratched into stone or drawn across fragile surfaces meant to outlast a single voyage. Now and then one of those maps resurfaces and unsettles us, not because it breaks history, but because it reveals how much intelligence can disappear between generations. Among the most discussed examples is the Piri Reis Map, a 16th century Ottoman chart pieced together from older sources. It is often described in exaggerated ways, as if it contains impossible knowledge. The truth is quieter and more interesting. It shows that information can travel across cultures in fragments: sailors' reports, inherited charts, copied coastlines, rumors refined into geometry. A map is never just a picture of land. It is a record of contact, ambition, error, and trust. That same tension appears in far older artifacts. Across different civilizations, archaeologists have found stones and carvings that may represent landscapes, rivers, fields, or ceremonial territories. Some seem practical. Others blur into cosmology, where geography and belief become impossible to separate. To ancient people, the world was rarely divided between physical space and sacred meaning. A mountain could be a landmark in an ancestor. A river could be a route in a divine presence. Mapping was not only about where to go, it was about how to belong. This may be why old maps feel so moving. They expose the humility of navigation. Every chart is an argument against case, drawn by someone who knew how easily a person could be lost. And every surviving map, however inaccurate by modern standards, contains a fierce human wish to make the unknown shareable. Perhaps that is what these artifacts teach us. The world has always been larger than our diagrams, but we keep drawing them anyway. Not because we expect perfection, but because the act of tracing what we know is also a confession of what we do not. What if the oldest machine in the world was built not to conquer nature, but to listen to it more carefully? Recovered in fragments from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, a corroded mass of bronze once looked like little more than debris. Salt had eaten through its surface. Time had fused its pieces together. But inside that ruin was a precision no one expected. Interlocking gears, calibrated teeth, rotating scales, and a design so intricate that it forced historians to reconsider what ancient engineering could achieve. The Antikythera Mechanism is often described as an ancient computer, and in one sense that is true. It could track celestial cycles, predict eclipses, and model the movements of the sun, moon, and perhaps even the known planets with astonishing sophistication. But the word computer can flatten its deeper meaning. This was not a device born from abstraction alone. It was an instrument of alignment, built in a culture where astronomy, mathematics, ritual time, and navigation all touch the same horizon. To hold such a device in the mind is to feel history shift slightly beneath your feet. We tend to imagine innovation as a steady climb, each generation adding one more stone to a staircase of progress. Yet here was a technology so advanced that nothing comparable appears again for many centuries. It suggests not a simple ascent, but a landscape of peaks and disappearances, moments when knowledge gathers brilliantly and then slips from view. That loss matters, not because it proves some hidden civilization beyond evidence, but because it reminds us how vulnerable intelligence is to war, decay, accident, and neglect. Libraries burn, workshops vanish, craftsmen die without apprentices. A culture may understand the heavens with elegance and still leave behind only fragments for strangers to decipher. In that sense, the mechanism is more than an invention. It is a witness. It tells us that human beings have long carried the desire to translate the sky into something touchable, to turn cosmic rhythm into motion, ratio, and brass. And perhaps that desire is itself ancient wisdom, not to own the universe, but to find our place within its turning. What survives longer? A city, or the memory of why it was built? At dawn, before the heat rises from the limestone, the great stones of forgotten cities begin to glow. Broken stairways catch the light. Empty plazas hold the footsteps of no one. Columns lean into silence. And somewhere beneath roots, dust, and centuries of weather, a pattern starts to emerge. These places were never random. They were measured against horizons, solstices, star paths, and the cycles that govern both crops and ceremony. Again and again, archaeologists have found that ancient monuments were designed with extraordinary attention to the sky. In Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in the British Isles, in the Andes and beyond, buildings seem to answer the movements of light with deliberate precision. A doorway frames the rising sun on one day only. A chamber fills with a narrow beam at midwinter. A pyramid stair casts the illusion of a descending serpent when the season turns. Stone becomes calendar. Architecture becomes memory. This is sometimes presented as a puzzle, as if ancient people possess some hidden power we cannot account for. But perhaps the deeper truth is more intimate. They watched. They watched for generations. They lived without electric light, without clocks glowing beside the bed, without cities dimming the stars. The sky was not background. It was instruction, warning, promise, and companion. To build in alignment with it was not exotic. It was sensible, reverent, and necessary. Still, there is wonder in the scale of it. These were not merely shelters. They were acts of collective attention. Entire communities organized labor, belief, and imagination around the conviction that human life should be placed in conversation with something larger than itself. That ambition feels both distant and familiar. We too arrange our lives around systems we barely comprehend, though ours are often digital, hidden, and immediate rather than celestial. The ruins endure because they ask a difficult question. When we build, what are we trying to line ourselves up with? Utility alone, power, permanence, or some deeper order we fear forgetting? Perhaps every civilization leaves behind not only its monuments, but its answer. What if the most delicate archive in human history was never meant to be permanent at all? There are discoveries that feel less like objects than interruptions. A scroll unsealed after 2,000 years, ink lifted from ash-darkened papyrus, fragments of text recovered from a cave where the air stayed dry enough to protect thought itself. In those moments, the past does not return all at once. It arrives in pieces, with tears, missing lines, and margins where silence has already begun its work. Ancient manuscripts carry a different kind of mystery from statues or machines. They do not only show us what people made, they reveal what they worried about, argued over, prayed for, and chose to preserve. A text can be practical, sacred, political, private, or all of these at once. It can survive because someone treasured it, or because disaster accidentally sealed it away. Either way, what reaches us is rarely complete. We inherit not a voice, but an echo. This is especially true of texts found far from the centers of empire. Scrolls hidden in desert caves, codices buried in tombs, tablets discarded in ruined rooms. Each one hints at a world of reading now mostly gone. We see traces of schools, rituals, trade, astronomy, medicine, law, and myth. We also see disagreement. Ancient societies were not intellectually uniform. They debated truth, copied alternate versions, revised traditions, and preserved ideas that later generations would reject or forget. That is why lost texts can feel so moving. They remind us that memory has never been neutral. Every civilization keeps some things and lets others fade. The archive is not the whole of human thought. It is the result of chance, climate, conflict, devotion, and power. What we call history is often what survived those filters. And yet even a damaged page can change the atmosphere of the present. A few lines can restore an entire horizon of feeling. Suddenly, the ancient world is no longer made of monuments alone. It becomes intimate again, full of hands, voices, hesitation, and hope. Perhaps the real wonder is not that so much has been lost, but that anything at all still speaks. What do we make of an object that looks useful, beautiful, and impossible all at once? From time to time, archaeology uncovers something that seems to stand slightly outside its era. A metal vessel with astonishing purity, a carved stone polished to a finish that appears almost modern, a small ornament whose geometry suggests patience beyond ordinary necessity. These discoveries often invite dramatic interpretations, but their real power comes from a quieter source. They reveal how often we underestimate the skill of people who left no manuals behind. Consider the ancient crafts that still challenge replication. Blades forged with techniques later lost, pigments whose chemistry remains difficult to fully explain, stonework fitted so precisely that even now it defies easy imitation. None of this requires fantasy. It requires respect. Old societies were not waiting for intelligence to arrive. They were already solving complex problems with the tools, materials, and inherited knowledge available to them. Their workshops were laboratories of touch, repetition, memory, and disciplined observation. There is something deeply human in that kind of mastery. A craft tradition lives not in theory alone, but in the body, in the angle of a wrist, the timing of heat, the pressure of a hand guiding a tool against stone, wood, or metal. When such traditions vanish, the object may remain while the method disappears. We are left staring at the result, fluent in analysis but estranged from process. We can measure composition, date the layer, compare styles, and still fail to recover the living chain of gestures that made the work possible. That gap between artifact and technique can feel almost spiritual. It reminds us that knowledge is not always written down. Sometimes it passes through apprenticeship, through habit, through the quiet confidence of doing something correctly 1,000 times. When that chain breaks, even ordinary excellence can begin to look mysterious. Perhaps that is why these objects continue to move us. They do not merely testify to lost civilizations. They testify to lost competence, lost patience, and lost ways of paying attention. And maybe the strangest thing is not that the ancient world made beautiful things, but that we are still surprised it could. What if the oldest secret hidden in ancient discoveries is not about what they knew, but about what they were trying to remember? Across generations, human beings have buried objects beside the dead, carved symbols into thresholds, aligned temples with returning light, and carried stories across centuries as if memory itself were a sacred duty. Many of the discoveries we call mysterious begin to look different when viewed through that lens. They are not always inventions in search of utility. Often they are vessels for continuity, built to help a fragile species remember what mattered before forgetting became inevitable. This is especially clear in ritual objects whose meanings have partly vanished. A ceremonial mask, a carved figurine, a disc etched with signs, a chamber designed for one day of sunlight each year. To us, they can seem opaque, even theatrical. But ritual is not decoration. It is a technology of remembrance. It takes fear, grief, gratitude, and cosmic uncertainty and gives them form. It says, this matters enough to repeat. This truth, whatever we understand it to be, must survive the weakness of individual memory. Archaeology often recovers the outer shell of that effort while losing the inner experience. We find the vessel but not the voice, the altar but not the song, the script but not the cadence in which it was spoken. That absence can tempt us toward exaggeration, yet something more grounded and more moving may be happening. We are standing at the edges of inherited meaning, close enough to feel its force, too far to fully enter it. And perhaps that is why these discoveries continue to linger in the imagination. They confront us with a paradox. The people of the past are gone, yet their need is recognizable. They wanted what we want, to carry love beyond death, to place order against chaos, to trust that some part of human experience could outlast weather, empire, and time. Maybe every ancient mystery is, in the end, a message about memory itself. Not perfect memory, not complete memory, only the stubborn, tender human refusal to let everything disappear. Why do certain discoveries seem to arrive not as answers, but as mirrors? By the time an artifact reaches us, it has already lived several lives. First, it belonged to the world that made it. Then it passed through loss, burial, ruin, forgetting, erosion. Finally, it entered ours, where museums, documentaries, headlines, and private imaginations begin shaping it all over again. What we call an ancient mystery is often a meeting point between two uncertainties: what the object once meant and what we now need it to mean. This is why interpretation matters so much. One age sees superstition where another sees science. One generation calls a figure divine, another symbolic, another psychological. We bring our own metaphors with us. In the industrial age, the past was often read as primitive. In the technological age, the same images may be read through machinery, systems, and coded intelligence. Each reading reveals something, but not only about the artifact. It reveals the anxieties and desires of the people doing the reading. That does not make interpretation worthless. It makes it human. To study the past is not to stand outside time, cold and neutral. It is to enter into conversation with absence. Scholars test evidence, compare context, date materials, and challenge speculation for good reason. Without discipline, wonder can drift into invention. But without wonder, evidence becomes dry and incomplete. The most honest history lives between those poles, where rigor and imagination keep one another in check. Perhaps that is the hidden drama behind so many ancient discoveries. They are not merely relics of vanished cultures. They are active participants in the present. They shape identity, inspire research, provoke debate, and remind modern people that certainty is often thinner than it appears. We want the past to confirm our worldview, but the past rarely behaves so obediently. Instead, it does something more valuable. It resists simplification. And in that resistance, it offers a strange kind of gift, the chance to become a little more humble, a little more curious, and a little more aware of how every age is haunted by the questions it asks of the dead. What if the real frontier of discovery is not buried underground, but inside the limits of our own certainty? In recent decades, ancient objects have been examined with tools their makers could never have imagined. Microscopes reveal wear patterns invisible to the eye. Chemical analysis traces pigments to distant sources. Imaging technology uncovers erased lines, hidden chambers, and text sealed inside layers of damage. With every new method, the past grows sharper. And yet, strangely, it also grows more complex. Better tools do not always simplify a mystery. Sometimes they deepen it. That is one of the quiet lessons of archaeology and historical science. Evidence rarely arrives as a perfect revelation. It comes in fragments, probabilities, revised dates, interrupted contexts. A single discovery can unsettle long-standing assumptions, but it can also expose how much interpretation depends on the questions being asked. New information does not simply fill in empty spaces, it reshapes the map. This is especially true when discoveries challenge familiar narratives of progress. We are often surprised to find sophistication in deep antiquity, as though intelligence belonged more naturally to the present than to the past. But the record tells a different story. Human beings have long been ingenious, observant, adaptive, and symbolically rich. What changes over time is not the existence of intelligence, but the forms it takes, the systems that preserve it, and the conditions that allow it to endure. So perhaps ancient mysteries are not embarrassments waiting to be solved. Perhaps they are reminders of proportion. They return us to the scale of time, where civilizations rise, flourish, forget, and vanish, while the earth keeps only selected traces. They ask us to accept that history is not a finished portrait, but an unfinished conversation between evidence and imagination. And that may be the most enduring revelation of all. The deeper we look into the past, the less entitled we become to easy conclusions. Not because truth is unreachable, but because truth in human hands is almost always partial. What matters is that we keep listening anyway. What remains after the artifact, the theory, and the argument have all fallen quiet? Perhaps only this: a human being standing in front of something old, feeling the distance between their life and another life that once felt just as immediate. That moment is easy to overlook, but it may be the true center of every ancient discovery. Beyond the dates, materials, and contested meanings, there is a recognition that the past was inhabited by people who feared loss, sought order, made beauty, and reached for permanence with fragile hands. This is why the most mysterious discoveries rarely leave us with triumph. They leave us with tenderness. A figurine shaped by someone whose name will never return. A mechanism assembled with astonishing care and then swallowed by the sea. A painted wall surviving only because darkness protected it. A script whose sound has vanished while its symbols remain. These objects do not simply prove that something happened. They preserve intention. And intention is one of the most intimate things time can spare. Seen this way, the hidden secret inside ancient history may not be hidden at all. It may be the continuity of human longing. Across continents and millennia, people kept asking versions of the same questions. Where do we come from? What governs the world? How do we remember? What deserves to endure? Every culture answered differently, but the act of asking binds them to us more strongly than any single conclusion. That recognition carries responsibility. To study the past honestly means resisting both dismissal and fantasy. We owe ancient people more than condescension and more than projection. We owe them patience, context, restraint, imagination disciplined by evidence, and evidence warmed by imagination. Anything less turns history into either spectacle or stone. And maybe that is the quiet transformation these discoveries offer. They do not simply expand what we know. They deepen how we know, teaching us that wisdom is not the end of mystery, but the ability to remain in its presence without rushing to break it open. In the end, the oldest discoveries do not shatter history. They soften it. They remind us that the past is not a locked room waiting for one final key. It is a landscape of partial light where each generation walks a little farther and learns with some humility that knowledge is never the same thing as possession. We uncover an artifact, decipher a pattern, reconstruct a tool, date a burial, trace a pigment, and for a brief moment the distance narrows. Then the shadows return, not as failure, but as part of the truth. What has emerged through this journey is not a catalog of solved enigmas. It is something quieter and more enduring. Ancient figurines, painted caves, mechanical fragments, ritual objects, forgotten texts, and celestial alignments all point toward the same human reality. Our ancestors were not incomplete versions of us. They were fully alive within worlds of meaning we can still sense, even when we cannot fully recover them. They observed the sky, honored the dead, built for memory, shaped beauty from scarcity, and asked questions large enough to survive them. That may be the deepest thread running through every mystery we have touched. The past is not distant because ancient people were alien to us. It is distant because they were human in ways both familiar and irretrievable. They loved, feared, calculated, imagined, and remembered under different heavens, in different languages, with different forms of order. Their answers have often faded. Their questions have not. So we arrive where all honest history eventually arrives, not at certainty, but at relationship, between evidence and wonder, between what survives and what is lost, between our need for explanation and our capacity for reverence. We do not inherit the past as masters. We inherit it as listeners. And perhaps that is enough. Because somewhere in every broken object, every unread sign, every stone placed in alignment with returning light, there remains a simple, enduring invitation to look more carefully, to imagine more responsibly, and to remember that the search for truth is also a search for kinship across time.